Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. One of the great things about RightsCon is, of course, has been that we are able to meet in person, but we have to pretend that we are having a fireside chat now, and unfortunately in a virtual setting. But my hope is that soon we will be living in a universe where physical contact is possible again, because social distancing imposes its own restrictions, which are not necessarily terrific, as we all have come to know over the last 16, 17 months. My name is Salil Tripathi. I have two roles. I chair the Writers in Prison Committee for PEN International, which is a global free expression organization for writers and readers, which believes in freedom to write and freedom to read. And I'm also the senior advisor for global issues at the Institute for Human Rights in Business, which tries to ensure that companies live by international standards. So it's a fascinating topic. And I have two astonishingly brilliant colleagues to talk with today. And I'm absolutely thrilled, as I'm sure all of you are. Let me introduce them one by one. First, Agnès Callamard. Agnès has been, of course, most recently the special rapporteur for extrajudicial executions at the UN, and has done two terrific bits of work. One is, of course, on the case of Khashoggi, which became almost the kind of lightning rod for how special rapporteurs deal with these issues and how they deal with human rights abuses, but also her persistent, stubborn in the positive sense of the term, and steadfast defense of human rights defenders who are facing pressures from recalcitrant governments. So we will talk about that as we go along. But she has also launched the Columbia Free Speech Initiative at Columbia University, where I had the privilege of working with her a little bit. And she has a history with Article 19 and with Amnesty International before that. And my other co-participant today is Irene Khan, who has, of course, been the Secretary General of Amnesty International, exactly the job that Agnès has right now. But we promise we won't be talking about just one organization. We are going to talk about human rights in general. But Irene is a special rapporteur at the moment for freedom of expression and opinion, which, of course, is an extremely important right, and which is always under siege. And it has both positive and negative outlooks because of what the digital age does. So I'm absolutely delighted to have both of you here, Irene and Agnès. I suppose a good way to start, and we'll try to keep this conversational so that it doesn't sound stilted, talking heads and all that. But I think that one of the intriguing things I found with the theme of the conference this year, which is keep it on the internet. We all know what happens when internet is shut off. Governments switch off networks. Government require companies to do so. We know the case of Vodafone in Egypt, where the cell phone system was taken down, and there have been other attempts to either restrict parts of the internet or the entire internet, ostensibly on the ground of security and safety. And yet, when you keep it on, there are other problems. One is, of course, proliferation of lies, what's called fake news, but what we're talking about is old-fashioned lies. And the other is the dissemination of hate speech. So my first question, somewhat provocative from a human rights perspective, is it worth keeping the internet on? Agnès?
Oh, sorry. I was going to leave that question to Irene. Of course, we need the internet on. It is and it has proven to be a fantastic, formidable tool and engine for organization, for communication, for coming together. We would not have managed to remain an integrated human rights community over COVID without the internet. We would have, frankly, disintegrated. Internet has allowed us to remain together and to work together. So, of course, we need to keep it on. We need to keep it on, particularly in situations where governments want to keep it down. Now, it does not mean that we want to keep it on without any kind of framework. And of course, the most important one is human rights framework. We don't want to keep the internet being driven, being controlled, either by governments or by multinational, super large, super big corporations. We don't want the internet to become simply a site of money making, a site of data collection, or a site for cyber conflict. It is, like the rest of the world, a space for conflict. It is not a space that we can just grab and work with as we probably had intended to do 20, 25 years ago. It is a place and a space around which and for which we human rights activists, human rights organizations, human rights defenders would have to fight over. And we are fighting over. That's what I think Keep It On means. Keep on the fight. It is a space that we need to fight for the soul of which we need to fight for.
Irene?
Yes, of course. I mean, we wouldn't be talking here today if the internet was not on. If anything, COVID-19 has shown how important it is for education, for health, for work, for connectivity with friends and family. For me, I see it as a public good. But of course, like so many other things in life, there is a dark side to it too that needs to be managed, and Agnès has pointed that out. What I would like to underline is keep it on, yes, but keep it on for everyone. And at the moment, there is a very large part of the world that has no access to internet. In fact, internet has the use of internet and the way in which its availability is around the world has created new fault lines of inequality, where 93% of the world's people are close to mobile broadband or internet, but only 53% actually have access to those services. And that, I think, is an unacceptable situation because so many human rights, application of human rights today, health, education, freedom of speech, are both economic and social rights, and civil and political rights are dependent on access to internet. So both the accessibility, the affordability, as well as the safety of internet is absolutely essential for human rights activists to take into account and to fight for.
I think that's a fantastic point you made, because too often when we talk about internet and human rights, the conversation tends to focus on the civil and political rights, right to expression, right to civil disobedience, right for defenders to come together, right for journalists to exchange information. What is often forgotten is how internet is becoming so ubiquitous in accessing essential services. Now, COVID is a very good example, when in country after country, we find that there is this illusion of access by saying that use your smartphone, register yourself, and somebody will send you a note when you can go for vaccination. And there are people who have either no access to smartphone or who have no access to the literacy necessary to be able to use the smartphone. People are elderly, people do not have language ability and all that. And I think that's extremely critical, particularly in the context of the change campus, where students are not in the same class but speaking in a forum like this. So I'm very glad you stressed that. And of course, both of you are human rights experts, and it brings in the whole argument of circle rights and the interdependency of human rights. And to see rights in isolation is not a very wise thing. My next question is about talking about what has become now, that we used to have these silos, that people were human rights defenders, people were journalists, people were state and duty bearers, and so on. But internet is changing those equilibriums in a significant way. What the internet has done is everyone has become an activist. Someone who has a smartphone can portray himself and can build a very credible following as a journalist or as a human rights defender and start documenting things. Police are wearing these cameras on their bodies in some countries, and people are recording police as they are managing demonstrations and so on. So how can the human rights movement itself manage the shift in the responses that are going on? How can it move away from what used to be a very inward-looking approach in the past, which was that of seeing things in silos? Because now pretty much anyone can produce evidence. And again, question to both of you, either of you can go first, but Agnès, maybe because you are running the largest membership-based human rights organization in the world, you might want to tackle that first.
I'm not sure I understood your question, Salil.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that internet is making everyone an activist or a journalist because you have tools to get it right. Now, historically, human rights community has been somewhat of an elite state that, we are the researchers, we are the ones who look at things, and we are the ones who pronounce a view. But that equation is now changing because of the access that the technology gives to internet. How are organizations changing to this challenge and responding to the challenge?
Okay. I don't fully agree with your assumptions. First of all, regarding the history of the human rights movement, I think it was a very mixed bag, and there were certainly people, in fact, the human rights movement was largely driven by and dependent upon actors at the local level without necessarily access to some of the means you are describing. The human rights movement, as you know, the human rights organization like Amnesty International in the past was certainly very dependent on the work done at national level in various locations by grassroots organization, by trade unionist, indigenous activists, and so on. So I will strongly question that the assumption that human rights was an elitist movement. I don't see it that way, at least. Second, in terms of what is happening now, yes, everybody can potentially become a transmitter, a vehicle, a communicator of information that is related to human rights protection, human rights solidarity, and so on. That, however, does not make human rights evidence. It is a potential information for human rights purposes, but as you have pointed out in your initial question, there is a great deal of noise on internet and through social media. A lot of it does not carry any meaning or weight from a human rights standpoint. If I take the example of Amnesty International, but this is applicable to a range of other people and organizations nationally and internationally, we and others have developed very clear expertise so that information that appears in the online world, so that videos, so that audios, and other forms of information is then assessed very thoroughly to determine whether they have been doctored with, to determine whether they can cross-check with a range of other sources. So information, noise, voice does not necessarily translate into evidence. It's only, so there is still a role for a range of actors at all levels, and translating the richness of what's happening in internet, the richness of people being able to communicate and to send videos and information, moving that into an evidence-based conclusion and finding is a super important step that a lot of people need to keep doing.
Thank you. Irene, yes.
Yeah, what I agree with Agnès that, of course, true human rights struggles have always been fought at the level of communities, local communities, whether it's in the village or in the region or in the country. That's where human rights change has come historically. But at the same time, I think what the digital age has done is it has created digital communities. So it's not just the villagers, but there is a digital village that has emerged, like the one that we are discussing now. Whereas in the past, you would have, for example, Amnesty members coming together in Amnesty groups. Now, actually, the groups are on the digital stage, and you can link up across borders, across ideologies in a way in which it was not possible to do in the past. I think in terms of activism, that opens up huge possibilities. And we see that happening with Black Lives Matter or #MeToo or all kinds of social movements that are coming up there, breaking boundaries, decentralization, empowering individuals to become activists. You don't have to have a card-bearing, don't have to be card-bearing member of a particular human rights organization to pick up an issue and express your views on it. On the other hand, as Agnès says, the expertise of human rights, of course, therefore becomes more diluted, and there is a risk of lower standards of human rights investigation, human rights monitoring taking place. But I think at the end of the day, it is the power of the individual and the faith and belief that we have as individuals in the power of human rights that's going to make the difference. Of course, when we have, as organizations, engage with governments, they need to have a certain standard and quality of their work. But when individuals go out in the street and demonstrate, they don't need that kind of expertise. That's much more passion. So I think the digital age has made passion much more available, but at the same time, expertise has come under pressure.
So I have a multiple layered question here. So I'll try to break it in part. Now, I mean, all three of us dearly miss a very close friend who we lost last year, David Petrasek, who used to think way ahead of others on philosophical issues on human rights. And David used to tell, I remember well, that, in 20 years ago, he was telling me that this model is going to break. He was prescient in saying that people-based organizations, we were talking about local NGOs, and he was not even thinking about community-based, but he had just come back from Philippines, and he was talking about people-based organizations, which had a completely different perspective. Now, that the passion part is very important, but what I have a question about, I'm not saying I'm concerned because standards vary, but my question really is about cultural relativism that might come in. So you might have a particular society where the middle class believes certain rights are extremely important, such as right to speak and right to free assembly, right to property, but they may be for the death penalty, or they may be for very strong anti-terror laws in their own country. And they are the ones who drive the human rights movement in that country. And there are contradictions. So how is the business model of human rights movement going to change as we go forward? Because clearly the organizations, you showed the divide very well, that there's passion on the streets and there's expertise on the part of the lawyers. But how do we blend this legal commitment on one side and passion on the other?
Well, it's not a new challenge, actually. It has happened in the past. I mean, I come from Bangladesh, and growing up, I lived through the war in Bangladesh in 71, and later on violations before the war, after the war, during the war, and so on. And what was happening on the ground was very, very real. Later, when I came into Europe, I didn't find much understanding of that at that time. I'm talking about the 80s and 90s. At that time, much understanding of the human rights struggle that was taking place there. So over time, of course, even within the UN human rights system, you see with the special rapporteur mandates, for example, my mandate on freedom of expression and opinion, or Agnès' mandate, these mandates were early mandates that were created in the 90s. And then now more and more mandates are developing on economic rights, on all kinds of social rights and so on. And so the notion of human rights is not a static one. As lawyers, Agnès and I both have the legal background. As lawyers, we like to see everything neatly, nicely written down, but real life is quite messy. And the human rights movement is a messy movement in that sense, where new ideas and thoughts have come in. People's experience have made it very real. Because after all, if human rights has no meaning in people's lives, then it's not going to survive. So yes, there will be tensions in societies, in certain societies where there will not be support for the death penalty. In other societies, there will be challenge to sexual orientation issues or sexual identity issues, women's rights. These are all struggles that have taken place. So when we talk about universality of human rights, it's not to me, it's not a static concept. The universality of human rights is challenged every day, is expanded. Consensus is built in one place, consensus is challenged in another place. That's the struggle of the human rights movement. And so I'm not actually worried about this. I'm pleased as long as people actually are debating human rights. That gives energy to it. I'd worry very much if human rights was caught in a book and put on a shelf.
Right. I want to, Agnès, you hinted a little bit about the way information is being gathered for human rights. And, your tenure as a special rapporteur, the one pivotal case in another country that I want to talk about both of them with you was, of course, the Jamal Khashoggi incident. And you investigated it persistently. You were courageous, you were steadfast, you were driven by evidence, and you took it to a frontier that you don't expect special rapporteurs to do. It was amazing the work you did in that. Now, what are the lessons you learned in that research methodology, and how would an amnesty researcher now approach, and what were the strengths you had? Because you were operating with the UN with you in a sense, and what were the weaknesses of that? Because so often you are dependent on member states being willing to participate in certain instances, and as well as what is the autonomy that an amnesty researcher would have as he or she goes about in such a research.
Thank you, Salil. Look, in terms of the research into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, I think the methodology I followed was not the typical special rapporteur methodology, because I focused on one case, and out of one single case being studied in great depth, I sought to extract recommendations and findings that went beyond the case. Most of the time, special rapporteur begin with the principles and work from within the logic of the law or the logic of the principle. When there are individual cases, they are being seen from the standpoint of the principle. I took the case and I questioned the principle. So that was a different inductive form of reflection, which I certainly will recommend. I don't think it is applicable to every situation, but in my particular case, by investigating the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, I was able to understand the very broad limitation of the international systems in terms of what it can do for single case, which is very little. I'll stop here to just say that it was a form of methodology that differed from the traditional approach, particularly the human rights approach, which begins with the principle and then apply the law or the principle to a case. I began with the case, I looked at the case, of course I referred to the principle, but I used the learning from the case to question the legal framework, to question public policies, and to question a range of implications.
Right. Irene, your reaction to that? I mean, is that the kind of approach you think is possible in the case of, because, when you're talking about EJEs, you're specifically talking about individuals. Right to information and opinion does involve individuals, but also there's a broader principle behind that.
Well, actually, that was an individual, but he was a journalist. So in a way, there is a cross over from Agnès' mandate to mine, and journalists, as you know, unfortunately, journalism is a dangerous profession today, and many of the killings of this kind happen to be of journalists. I think what Agnès is saying is a very interesting approach. She's talking about a very interesting approach, particularly when you want to expose the gaps and weaknesses of the international human rights law system. And it goes back to our earlier discussion about how important the reality is in the human rights world, and that we not live with principles and values and create an ideal world, which is great for debate and analysis and so on, but doesn't make a difference in people's lives. So what Agnès was doing, taking a real case to show that the international system is not equipped to deal with this kind of killing, even though it is a blatant violation, the crudest, most cruelest form of violation that can take place, but the international system is not equipped to deal with it. And so what do you need to do with it, and how can you strengthen the situation and so on? So, and there are many, many areas where we are actually finding that the principles are fine, but the application is in trouble. And that's why and I think the UN human rights system has created quite a unique mechanism that governments have actually given power to individuals, with full independence, to speak out in the name of the UN. And that is quite remarkable in a membership-based organization to create this special rapporteur system. And what I just want to mention here is that civil society actually is our biggest champion, and they need to continue to champion us, because obviously we threaten governments, we criticize governments, and Agnès herself has done so with some cost to her own safety, security, and peace of mind. So we need civil society to keep backing the special rapporteurs and to make sure that we don't get eroded by the politics of the UN.
Yeah, but there's the other threat that special rapporteurs have always had, which is, the threat from states, which either don't let them in to start with. I mean, there are countries which, hold regular elections. I mean, whether they're democratic is a different question. It's impossible for the rapporteur to go to those countries, even for relatively less political rights. I always say relatively because every right has a political element. So I don't want to say that some rights are political and some are not. But even the right to health has political implications. So I certainly don't want to make less of that. But again, I want to start with you, Agnès, and then come back to Irene on the next question, which is a kind of almost vituperative hatred you attracted from some governments, Agnès, because of your exceptionally courageous and strong stance on extrajudicial executions. And I have in mind Philippines here, because every time you said something about Philippines, the president used unparliamentary language in responding to you. They were misogynistic. They were targeting you because you were a woman. And then, of course, there were lots more. And each time I would retweet something you had said, I would also get abused in Tagalog, which I didn't understand, but that happened to me, and it happens to me in Turkish as well. So I mean, when I speak about Mr. Erdogan and his government, so I'm used to it in a way. But the question, therefore, is that what do we do about cleaning up this space so that it becomes more civil? Is it possible? I mean, you obviously didn't care, and you said exactly what you needed to. Everyone is not able to do that. So how can we? Is it possible to make the internet a more receptive space, or is that just a pipe dream?
There are different layers to your question, Salil. One is about the individual themselves and how prepared and willing they are to stand up. And that is very much driven by their personal, environment, I think, and where they are located. I was, frankly, quite safe. I worked as a special rapporteur. I was mostly based in countries which I think would not have gone out of their way to hurt me or to harm me. And in fact, possibly they would go out of their way to protect me. So compared to individuals currently in Egypt or in Turkey or in the Philippines, through the red tagging in particular, my position was really a very privileged one, and in many ways it was easy for me to speak the way I was. So that's the first thing. That being said, how much support you get when you speak up, I think is extremely important. Who is prepared to stand by your side? Who is prepared to have your back? Who is prepared to go out of their way to communicate their support? That matters a great deal. It mattered to me, and I'm sure it matters even more for people who are on the front line of harm and violence. I got a lot of that, not from institutions, but from other individuals and from a variety of actors, and that gives you the strength and the the environment that you need in order to keep speaking up and speaking truth to power. So I would like to invite whoever is listening, always stand up for those who are taking the risk. Even if you don't know them, just write to them, use Twitter, use social media, express your support to whoever is courageous, whoever is taking a stand, because they will get so much from those marks of support. But then you also ask questions about whether the internet can be made more civil, and here we're looking more at regulations and content moderation. It's a very different questions. One of my realization when I got attacked or criticized or the object of organized campaign is in fact that the problem may not be one individual statement. The problem is rather the way people are organized online to work as a mob against individuals. So it is rather the use of the digital space for mobbing people, a little bit like, you're suddenly in the street and hundreds of people go after you to lynch you. That to me is one of the dimensions of the digital space which does not receive sufficient attention, because you're going to focus on the content, maybe on one individual, but the capacity of the internet providers or of other actors to control that form of activism for the sake of, or misuse of trolls, creation of trolls, to create that impression of collective dimension and a mob going after you. I think we don't have sufficient tools. I remember at the time when I was mobbed by thousands of Philippine individuals or just fake accounts, I reached out to Twitter and they pointed out to me that, and they were right, that the initial statement from one very well organized person did not violate their community standards, which was fine. However, when then thousands, if not more, I'm talking thousands and thousands of people then grab that statement and mob you with it, that to me was what Twitter was not prepared to tackle. And when the person that did not break the rule has access to those mobs, to those trolls, to those fake accounts, that I think is what they need to be far more prepared towards. I think they are getting better, by the way, but at the time they could not help me, and I spent hours and hours and hours just blocking or muting, thousands of people. Thank you.
And I think the point you make, there is an element of complacency that creeps in among others, that, this is offline with no online implications. And Irene, I wanted to come to you on that, because you so very well know cases of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, or Gauri Lankesh in India, and about a few years earlier, Anna Politkovskaya in Russian Federation, where these very brave women journalists had received online threats. And, people, it's only online. And then all of them were murdered later on. I'm not trying to suggest that the people who murdered were those who were making the threats, but it created an atmosphere in which it was possible. And it's not a coincidence that all the examples we are citing are of women here. Right? So there is a misogynistic, gender-based element to it. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how do we grapple with it. I'm writing a paper as we speak, as I was telling you a few days ago, exactly on the threats to women online, and it pervades even beyond that with deep fake and humiliation. And I know several human rights defenders and writers who have gone off internet or at least off social media because they don't want that exposure because there are far more important things to do.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's a very close connection between the offline and the online. Sometimes in the offline, in the real world, a political leader will say something, and we have seen how that is then picked up online, spread, amplified, and used then to create more offline violence. So the relationship between online and offline is very close and complex one. And I actually, in one of my first meetings with, I think it was with Twitter actually, by coincidence, Agnès, where I asked them what lessons they had drawn from the past year, the COVID-19 year, and they said that they had begun to realize how what happens online, what kind of impact it has offline. So even for the social media platforms, that was an awakening that these are not two different things. After all, both online and offline, the manipulation is actually at some point done by a human being or human beings. I think we need to keep that in mind. It's not that technology is just taking over and working automatically. And that realization, I think it comes to women, but it also certain minority groups and others, vulnerable, people at risk. And particularly for women, because we go back to the old gender power struggle that happens in real life, that is still happening as women becoming more prominent, as women are demanding equality and justice. Those same dynamics are transferring, of course, online and making it very hard for women, and especially women in public life online, to carry out their work. But there are clear things that we have learned on how to deal with hate speech. There has been a lot of work done that, and Agnès was also involved, of course, in the Rabat Plan of Action, in creating guidelines and criteria of how to manage hate speech, because freedom of expression is not an absolute right. Freedom of expression can be restricted, but under certain conditions in international law, lawful, necessary, proportionate, and on legitimate grounds. It can be prohibited when it's an incitement to violence. Those measures should be used in an appropriate manner, and I emphasize appropriate, because very often what happens is the excuse of controlling hate speech becomes a cover for carrying out censorship. So we must be very careful about where we draw lines, and there must be greater realization on the part of companies of the responsibility that they have. They are an intermediary, true, but they are a very powerful intermediary of words and language and message and communications, and they have some responsibility there. Unfortunately, the business model of the companies are not usually, don't get enough attention. There is attention given to content moderation, but not to the business model, where they have an interest very often in keeping people attracted, in using various mechanisms which actually then lead to disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech. So there needs to be much stronger realization on their side that their products that they are creating should undergo due diligence, human rights due diligence, and human rights impact assessment, and they need to be much more transparent about their rules, and they need to create, for example, the mobbing that you were talking about, Agnès. It's very easy through even through algorithms and automated means to see in that traffic where the traffic is being driven, and then to see why the traffic is being driven there. The traffic might be driven there for very good reasons, but it can also be driven there for wrong reasons. And they need to look into those issues much more carefully. And they can do that if they were to engage with the people whose rights are being affected. I think it's much more necessary for the digital companies and digital platforms to begin to talk with people whose rights are being affected. And that's where the multi-stakeholder approach is such a useful one to think about when we talk about the digital world. Because, in the real world, You have states and you have companies. And then you have civil society making a noise around. But when you go to the online world, that's when there's need for close partnership between the various entities to figure out how to deal with these dark forces that are moving there.
Yeah, you use the word hate speech, and I just wanted to make a very small interjection there and then move on to precisely the theme you spoke about, Irene, which is disinformation. I'm just coming to that because you've written a report on it. And hate speech, you know, the lack of clarity, and Agnès, you also dealt with it during your article 19 days about, you know, what hate speech means. And it has basically come to mean the speech you hate is hate speech. And it ends up undermining the whole notion of freedom of expression. And I think there is need for greater clarity. And Agnès, I also wanted to thank you for pointing out the need to express solidarity with the people who show courage, because, you know, through PEN, we work with writers who are in prison. Amnesty, of course, you know, has this prisoner of conscience iconic idea that Amnesty came up with at its founding. And we hear repeatedly from writers who have subsequently been released from prison how important it was for them to receive that support. So I can't stress that enough. I can't endorse that enough. We have them coming and meeting us later at our PEN meetings, and they say that, you know, what mattered the most, what made us feel that it was worth going on, this suffering was worth it, was these letters and these messages that came our way. Emo Meo Messi, the famous writer in Africa from Cameroon, I remember him telling us once that he was, his jailer said that, you know, why are you getting all these letters? Are you some kind of a VIP? And he said, yes, I'm a very important prisoner. That was his reply at that time. So there you go. So thank you for making that point. But Irene, speaking about disinformation and the report you did, who should decide what's said and not what's not said on the internet? There was a time when we felt that we could trust government because companies were monopolies. You know, Facebook is, you know, has more members than any country in the, more users and the population of any country in the world. And, you know, they have huge revenue models and so on. But then at the same time, we have situations of certain countries. And I know, Agnès, you just released your report today on Xinjiang in China. I think I was listening to it on the radio this morning. You have countries, I mean, situations like Myanmar, like Kashmir, like Xinjiang, and now Nigeria taking on Twitter, where the state is asserting its power and curbing the role of the social media to speak, ostensibly on this ground of you know, curbing disinformation. So how do we navigate that space? What lessons you learned as you wrote your report, and where can we rely on the company and where can we rely on the state in this multi-stakeholder model?
That's addressed to me.
Yes, because I mean,
yes.
it's to tell us about your disinformation.
Yes. Well, you know, this.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when it comes to freedom of expression, both the state and the company have vested interests. The state for its political interests and the company for commercial interests. And that's why I think it's important to look at the international law human rights framework, to look at international human rights law, which is very clear. Who decides? The rights holder. It's an empowering right, and therefore it's not a right that can be easily restricted by either state or company. On the contrary, the state has the responsibility to respect human rights, but also to protect human rights, and that means protect it from abuse or attack by non-state actors, including companies, the private sector. And governments need to therefore apply human rights rules to their own policies. They should not actually use companies to censor speech. In many parts of the world, governments are now not censoring themselves, but putting restrictions on social media, and therefore getting social media to do something that is then not subject to any judicial scrutiny, any means of remedies for the individuals. And that is, of course, totally wrong. Companies, on the other hand, also have to make sure that their own community standards are in line with human rights. Their products, as we were talking earlier, the services they provide do not lead to violation of human rights, and that they are transparent. One of the biggest problems with the digital platforms, of course, is that we don't know what's happening there. And that is without transparency, you cannot have accountability. And that is where I think governments, the state, should not regulate the content online unless it is in extreme cases, as we talked about, incitement to violence and hatred and those types of extreme cases. But what the state should be doing is regulating social media on transparency, on accountability, on due process. And I think that the way forward really is much more approach of social media councils, for example, where there is a multi-stakeholder approach with users, with companies and with governments talking together to see what's the best way of regulating online speech. You know, under international law, false speech, anything that is false, is not necessarily prohibited. What is restricted, what can be restricted or prohibited, is the harm that emerges from false or manipulated speech. So the focus should be there, but that focus has to be a very narrow one, because very often the line between what is misinformation and disinformation and what is actually censorship is a very fine one. And more governments are now introducing laws. In fact, 20 states during the COVID-19 period, 20 states introduced legislation on fake news. And very often those laws were so vague that, of course, a lot of permissible speech was restricted. Companies are being, when we look at how companies are behaving, they have introduced various measures to improve content moderation, in particular in relation to misinformation and disinformation, but they haven't really looked at their own business models that lead to the creation of disinformation. They haven't really commit themselves to transparency, but they haven't really been transparent, especially when it comes to algorithms, when it comes to recommender systems and so on. There is a lack of transparency there. And what we also see is the disparity in their practice across different geographies. The largest social media platforms are, of course, very acutely sensitive to their largest markets, which happen to be in the Western countries, in the global North. And we find very different treatments by these companies in the global South. And the users, of course, are treated very differently. So that's a big danger. So I think there's a lot that can be done here to bring better practice, but we will learn when we work together. And I think the UN system, the governments, the major governments that are looking in this area, for example, the European Union and the large companies, all have a huge responsibility to come across down at the table with civil society, academics and scholars and representatives of users to try to figure out effective multi-stakeholder systems for dialogue and to find solutions.
We have 12 minutes, and Anya, so very quickly to you, we have 3 questions. I want to come to the question. So very quick question to you. Can we trust companies to be honest brokers in this? As you know, content moderation and so on, because Irene has shown up the challenges. Do you think, from an Amnesty perspective, you think you can trust companies?
Look, I think I would not approach the issue from that standpoint, Salil. First, I have from a broader global perspective, if not historical, I will say that right now the system is extremely unstable. It's unstable because the technology is evolving. It's unstable because the actors are changing. And to try to create a regulatory framework upon something that is constantly changing is very difficult, if not impossible. Second, therefore, we need to understand that, in my view, we are in a period of testing out. Governments are testing out, companies are testing out, users should also be testing out. We are very far from having a solidified, stable system to manage this new space called the digital space, which, as you pointed out earlier, is everything space, you know? So we are testing out, and I want to look at those different approaches from that standpoint. The governments and us need to test out. I believe personally that in the current environment, international law is a good driver, but it is a driver that needs to be challenged so that it can accommodate the existence of actors other than the states. I would like to think that corporate actors can self-regulate in an effective way for the purpose of the protection of the global public good, but I don't know whether they will reach that stage without being considered as duty bearers under international law, including international human rights law. At the moment, they're not. I think it's a problem. Personally, in all my writing on the regulation of internet, I have increasingly moved towards recommending that we consider the corporate actors in the digital space as legally bound by international law, and that if international is not there yet, we need to reform international law. So that's where I'm going. It does not mean that there is no role for government. Of course, there are. I think Irene has highlighted some of them, which is really focusing on the working of the commercial sector, the antitrust regulations, the control over market, the control over the size, and so on and so forth. So I will, I do believe that we really need to try out different approaches. I think the Facebook Oversight Board is a way for those companies to explore their responsibilities. Unlike many, I think a number of people, I am very interested in the kind of jurisprudence that this Oversight Board is going to establish, because it is our real first attempt to have a global jurisprudence over global content. Not perfect, but like I said, we're in a period where we need to test out various things. Some will survive, some will not.
Great. We have 8 minutes. We have 3 questions. If you can keep your responses brief. The first question is from Chip, and it is, I think, better for Irene. Is there any norm or mechanism in the UN regarding preventing global digital platforms from systematically violating users' digital rights and freedom of expression? Do we have any UN mechanisms?
No, for the same reasons, not a UN mechanism, but for the same reason that Agnès just explained, that companies are not directly responsible for human rights under international law. So the UN cannot reach out to them. There are voluntary mechanisms that have been developed, for example, the Global Compact. There are other means that exist of multi-stakeholder entities that are coming up where companies are also working, but these are all voluntary means. At the end of the day, you hold companies responsible under national law. And I think the states, when you look at the monopoly of the companies, where they're located, and the kinds of countries where they're located in, then I think some countries have a bigger responsibility here to wake up and do something about it. We see some interesting developments in the context of the European Union. Not all of it is necessarily perfect. There are some risks there. And at the end of the day, of course, the national regulators play a big role. But I do think that companies have to be brought under greater control. The UN may not be the best outfit for it. They are struggling to maintain some respect for human rights among their own member states, let's not forget. So I'm not sure that bringing companies within the rubric of the UN will be the best way of dealing with it. But certainly companies need to be regulated. And they are regulated in many sectors. So this is not a new issue. Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things that often forgot. There are lots of laws that do apply to companies, and it's not a completely law-free space. That's important. And then another initiative, of course, is the Global Network Initiative, which is very relevant in this specific sector. We are talking about the digital one. Agnès, I think that the question from Ines, you can wear both your hats and respond, but I think from the civil society perspective, it always seems that we have civil society and the UN Special Rapporteur on one side and the state on the other, yet we see relatively little change and rampant impunity. What other actors can be mobilized to achieve change and the respect for human rights, such as parliaments and businesses? What idea?
Thank you. First of all, I can assure Ines that we have a much more sophisticated approach to human rights work, as I'm sure she does actually. So in a lot of campaign, lots of global advocacy around human rights situation, we will call on states to intervene. It's not, we don't always work against all states. We may have a position against one state, and in order to have some impact on the human rights situation, e.g. in China, we do need to call on other states to do the right thing. We need to call on other states to stand for the UN Charter, to stand for international human rights. So it is absolutely not civil society against states. I think it is a much more diffuse and integrated approach to human rights protection. With regard to corporate actors, of course they have a role to play. At the moment, like I said, I find their role a bit too limited. Further, to go back to the previous questions, over the last 10 years, our capacity to hold corporate actors for human rights violations has actually decreased. We used to be able to do far more under American tort law and around other laws related to terror, to torture. That has actually shrunk due to some jurisprudence. At the European level, it is impossible to hold corporate actors to account for human rights violations they may have committed abroad, or very difficult. The European jurisdictions have not managed, in fact, to develop a system or the legal jurisprudence or the legal framework that allows for that to happen. So there are real limitations at the moment in terms of holding corporate actors for account for human rights violations they commit abroad. We may do that inside our country, but for what they do abroad, it's not there. It does not mean that we do not work with corporate actors. Of course, we have, I'm sure Irene has many relationships, and so do I, with digital corporate actors, because they are part of the solution. They may be part of the problem, but they are certainly part of the solution, and we need to work with them. We need to come up with recommendations. We need to understand maybe the limitation that they are encountering. I think as civil society, we also need to work outside the comfort zone. We need to be prepared to make tangible recommendations, not just at a principle level, but really try to be very practical, very policy oriented, while continuing to push the bigger envelopes, such as demanding or suggesting that the international legal framework need to be adapted to the 21st century, which means that we need to find a role for non-state actors.
Thank you. We have almost just 1 minute, so we are really on time. So Irene, in only 1 minute, I'm sorry, it's a profound question and it's very hard to squeeze it, but this is from Mark. Will the UN Secretary General's creation of an Office of the Envoy on Technology help you in promoting rights online and positive action by member states and global tech companies?
Yes, I think so, because at the political level, it will show support, and technology is not, there are specialized agencies in the UN that work on technology, but within the UN Secretariat, in the main part of the UN, there isn't a place where one can have conversations about technology, the future of technology. The Secretary General, of course, has a roadmap on digital technology. And as I said, technology is not just about social media platforms or even about human rights. It has a cross-cutting impact on everything that the UN does: peace, security, development, human rights. And it's very important to make sure that all parts of the UN are going in the right direction to improve people's lives and livelihoods and protect their rights. So yes, it would be helpful to have a strong center there. I mean, that's an easy question, I think.
Thank you. And that's a very nice positive note to end this very difficult question, because it is a grim and not a very not a topic on which one can be very hopeful about. But thank you for both of your excellent work in this regard. We await the outcomes with great anticipation and support as Amnesty and as a special rapporteur, both of you. We have freedom of speech, which we have taken for granted, but there is always, it's important to have freedom after speech and freedom to reach. So thank you very much again, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.